Okay, so the war ends in 1918. The United States is on the winning side and certainly has a new global reputation and power. In 1919, the victorious powers are to have a conference in Paris. It's called the Versailles Conference, in Versailles, right? It's outside of Paris. Now, Germany had sued for peace in 1918 based on some very specific reasons. And that means we got to go back. Remember, we were talking about Woodrow Wilson. And we said that he, between January and April 1917, it had been slowly moved into war, and by whatever reasons, economic reasons, trade reasons. But way back in January of 1917, Woodrow Wilson had presented to the warring powers a plan. It's called his 14 points. And his 14 points essentially included points that said things such as we need to demilitarize, no reparations. And reparations are the bill that the losers pay in war. So if you win a war, you don't pay for the war, you make the loser pay for the war. Those are reparations. Woodrow Wilson said everybody pays for their own war. Right? We will have self-determination. Now understand, Woodrow Wilson was one of the most racist presidents of the 20th century. So when he said self-determination, he meant white people. Right? Remember that for later on. Right? But he said self-determination. Right? And he presented the idea for a League of Nations. The idea that a league, a global organization of nations, particularly run by the West, of course, would create a political and a military organization, League of Nations, and that this League of Nations military would be used to end all war. That whenever conflict broke out, this League of Nations army would go to there and stop the conflict, wouldn't take sides, essentially stop it and keep it from breaking out into a bigger war. Every nation that joined the League of Nations would have to contribute money. They would contribute soldiers, have to contribute military equipment to this army. That's his basic idea. He went over to Versailles, 1919, as a representative for the United States. Now, many, many nations showed up. He came with his 14 points. Germany had sued for peace based on these 14 points. Now, back in January 1917, nobody listened to Woodrow Wilson. This is a stupid idea. But by 1918, as the nation's retiring, and particularly Germany could see that they were going to lose the war, decided before they actually lost territory, before they had been invaded, they would simply sue for the peace based on the 14 points. At the Versailles Treaty, it became very clear that the 14 points were not going to be followed. Woodrow Wilson came with them in hand. But the major powers, in particularly Britain, led by Lloyd George, and France, led by Clemenceau, had no intention of letting Germany off on such soft terms. They intended on Germany paying for everything. Versailles Treaty eventually will give Germany a bill of $38 billion for the war. Eventually, the Versailles Treaty will say nothing about self-determination. It does not really demilitarize. A couple of examples. We know a delegation from West Africa showed up, of West Africans specifically to ask for self-determination. If you're talking about self-determination, what about the colonials? What about the colonial people, colonized people? They didn't make it into the meeting. And there were other groups and people who tried to get in to speak for the colonized people. They were not allowed to voice themselves. Germany was not invited to the meeting. So it was very clear that this was going to be a treaty that would be dictated specifically to Germany, and they would have no say in its outcome. The Versailles Treaty gave Wilson none of his 14 points except the League of Nations. He did get his League of Nations. Now, with the Versailles Treaty in hand, he went back to the United States. Of course, just because he wants it doesn't mean that it's going to be agreed to. He's got to get the Senate to agree it. Here is where political issues become involved. Wilson was a Democrat. When he went to the Versailles Treaty, he did not bring one powerful Republican with him. Republicans in 1918 had won control of both houses, the representatives and the Senate. So they saw Wilson as trying to set up the presidential election of 1920 for the Democrats. They saw Wilson going to the American public and say, hey, we won the war and now we won the peace, vote for Democrats. So they're very suspicious of Wilson and his Versailles Treaty. The general public were suspicious. Americans always lived on this idea that we fight for democracy and freedom. No matter what the real reasons may be, we always say we're fighting for democracy and freedom and liberty. And there wasn't much of this in the Versailles Treaty. So much of the public questioned whether we should sign this. Wilson tried to get the public to turn around. He went on a big train campaign to try to get the public to speak up and support the Versailles Treaty. Unfortunately for him, he had a stroke. And spent the last few months back in Washington in bed. So the United States never signed the Versailles Treaty. We never joined the League of Nations. We signed independent treaties with different countries and will not be a voice in the 1920s globally. In fact, we will go back to our isolationist policies in the 1920s, or at least try to, and when it comes to politics and military. Okay, guys, that's World War I.